Let me just say a couple of words. First of all, welcome to everyone, especially to Stefaan De Rynck. This is one of our EGPP seminar series sessions in the form of a book presentation, because we tend to alternate book presentation, research seminars, presentations by the researchers from the European Union Working Group. And we're very happy to be able to have this presentation today with this book, Inside the Deal, How the EU Got Brexit Done, with Columbia University Press. Congratulations on this book. I can only imagine it was a lot of work, and it turned out to be a very important book that received reviews in important outlets like the Financial Times, one that I read. So welcome, Stefaan, and thanks for being with us. So Stefaan De Rynck was a very close aide, actually the senior advisor to the EU Brexit negotiator Michel Barnier, and more generally a long-time civil servant in the EU in different areas, from financial regulation to the single market, transport policy and urban development, or sustainable urban development, I think, and EU treaty change. And he knows the UI very well because you did your PhD here, as so many of us then found a way to come back. So welcome back, and I give you the floor for 35 minutes, 40 minutes presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle, and thank you also to you and the Schuman Center and the seminar program to invite me. It's fantastic to be back. I'll speak for around 30 minutes, as you said, about the book which came out a few months ago, Inside the Deal, How the EU Got Brexit Done, which is the story about how the EU negotiated Brexit. If you would be interested to read it, I mean, Philip Van Parijs was also a professor here, or visiting professor. Told it a thrilling account, but I should warn you that David Frost, who was Boris Johnson's negotiator, called it rather dry. So it's not an academic book. It doesn't have references. Still, it is a serious analysis and storytelling of what had happened. It's not an academic book, but I think if I start from there, there's no theory in there. There's no reflections on intergovernmentalism or what drove this process or supranational. But there is, on the one hand, of course, I come from this institute, so there is a bit of an academic slant to it, but I think it's also a book where academics can use as a source to analyze what happened in the Brexit negotiations. And I think it's important to keep studying those negotiations because it tells us quite a bit about the nature of the European Union. Of course, Brexit had a huge impact on the UK and reshuffling of political identities in the UK and devolution and all the rest of it, but it also had an impact on the EU, and we can discuss that. But for me, it's a constitutional moment in a way also. The way also these negotiations have been done, and it's quite useful, I think, to remind ourselves of when the referendum happened, how people predicted that this could lead to the demise or the disintegration of the European Union. Of course, people in the media called it a shock and the biggest crisis that the EU had faced, and this came after migration and the Euro crisis. Salvini said we should leave the sinking ship. Le Pen said we should have a referendum on the Euro at least. Geert Wilders said we should also leave the European Union. The British press obviously said this would be the demise of the EU, but also in political circles, there was fear about that. At the highest level in some countries of the contagion of Brexit to certain member states. And also in academic circles, people like Ivan Krastev or Ben Rosamond spoke about this. Vivian Schmidt, I just read a piece yesterday. She didn't speak about the demise, but she said the future of the EU is at stake. And the EU needs the UK for effective leadership over the years to come. So it's quite useful to look back at this and to think about that. But okay, the first thing I would like to focus on as part of my presentation is the institutional structures that were set up to deal with the Brexit negotiations. And they were quite unique, not just in the Commission, but also in the Council. unique inside those institutions in terms of how intra-organizationally the institutions got their act together, unique in terms of their interinstitutional dimension, the relationships between the three key institutions, Parliament, Council, and the Commission. And then the relationship, especially between the Commission, but also member states and outside stakeholders, which I think were unique and has never been reproduced so far in any other EU setting. And you know this, so I'll just go very briefly through it, but in the Commission, Juncker created a task force. This was discussed with member states at the highest level, with the German Chancellor, the French President, with other actors. The Dutch and the Slovak Prime Minister also were involved in as the two presidencies. The Slovak Prime Minister was Fico back then, Social Democrat at that time. So the decision was taken that Michel Barnier would have a task force, but also, and importantly, direct authority over the whole Commission. So the commissioners were in a way deprived of their authority whenever it came to Brexit-related matters. That doesn't mean they were not involved. Barnier went to the college, which is also quite unique, that a non-college member goes to the college to discuss Brexit and see what the feeling is of the College of Commissioners, involve them, but the formal decision was that he could rely on Directors General and give them instructions on Brexit. That led, not in the beginning, but after a few months, to the European Council saying, okay, well, we trust this structure to do the negotiations on our behalf. And in December 16, a few months after Barnier had been appointed, the European Council, the leaders crucially said, we will not discuss Brexit matters with the UK. So we will not circumvent the structure. Whether that would happen was uncertain at that time. Let's just be clear about that. But at least that was the commitment that was taken. We know bilateral contacts. There was still some hesitation. And Barnier, in his first tour of capitals back then, as I document in the book, October, November, spoke to some prime ministers who didn't think he would be the lead negotiator, who thought it would be more the technical part and someone else would be the lead negotiator. So that fell into place there. Part of that was a very inclusive way from the Commission to start with working with member states from the start, and also some, what I call in the book, some ego management of some of the players also in Brussels. But we, as task force, we were 10 people back then. We brought member states together. We had joint presentations from the legal services of the Council and the Commission, which is also quite unique, on citizens' rights, on the financial settlement, on the issues that will come to us. Now, on the Council side, and if I just say just one more thing on these seminars, when I think back about them, when I thought about the presentation, there was a lot of confusion at that time. We should remind ourselves of that. I remember on the citizens' rights, member states didn't know who would be competent for what, because there were social security issues involved and pensions. There was a national competence. And what does Article 50 exactly mean? And how are we going to do this? Will there be a cutoff date for citizens? And some member states said, but the cutoff date should be rather soon. And there was quite a bit of different views around the table. Now, to come back to the Council, there was decisions taken within the Council by the Secretary General and by Donald Tusk, to say we will also set up a structure in the Council for Brexit. The worry there was that Brexit would transversely affect all the Council formations because Brexit touched upon everything. And so to insulate that in the Council was an important decision, but the Council Working Party and then later on the Council at political level meeting under the Article 50 formation. And what was unique about all of this is the constant communication, and we had subsequently throughout the years between our task force and that Council Working Party. We had on average 3-4 meetings a week, I think, to discuss various issues. I'll perhaps come back to that in the discussion. But I think that was crucial, that structure, to allow a forum to have a common understanding of what was happening throughout these negotiations in the 4 years to come. It was crucial to build a common understanding. It was crucial also to build trust between us as task force and the principals for whom we were negotiating, which were, of course, the member states and then different levels of diplomacy. And then the final thing, so inside institutions, interinstitutionally, and the final thing was on our side, this transparency with stakeholders, with publishing our positions online before we even discussed with the UK. We, of course, said this is a democratic tool. We need to involve everyone, but it was also a factor, a variable for us to maintain the unity of the 27, to avoid manipulation of information, to avoid that prime ministers would discover in the Financial Times what was happening basically in the Brexit negotiations, which would be damaging for the unity of the 27. Let me perhaps say something about the UK very briefly, just to remind ourselves of the elements of the story. What I just described, the building up of the structures, happened during what we call the no negotiation without notification period, the 9 months before May eventually submitted the Article 50 letter. The UK took a very tough line during Theresa May, during that period, say we will leave the single market, we no longer want the Court of Justice, no more free movement of people, no deal's better than a bad deal, and some veiled threats to withhold security cooperation if the future relationship was not an adequate relationship from the UK's perspective. We also had at that time this infamous Downing Street dinner where May basically said, my approach is to do what it did in Justice Home Affairs. The treaty allowed the UK to opt out of everything, opt into other things. We'll do the same for the economic and security relationship going forward, which set off a lot of alarm bells on Juncker's side, who was at that dinner, obviously, with Barnier. And if I look back at that period, the discrepancy between what we did in Brussels and what's happening in the UK was enormous. There were two different planets. And you say it's always nice to come back to Florence. I remember coming to the Schuman Center in October 16 or November 16. Bridget Laffan had organized a first EU-UK encounter between academics from both sides. And the UK academics, not all of them, but many of them were again on a different planet. All about, and then I come to the point about how we framed these negotiations beyond the structures, how the EU, not just the task force, let's be careful here, but how we framed those negotiations as Brexit is a UK problem. We're not going to internalize that into the EU. Whereas many people on the UK side were saying, well, this is an EU problem. We'll have to solve this together. In the book, I recount one of these anecdotes, which also became public at some point, where Merkel said to reporters off the record at Davos, Theresa came to me and she said, what are you offering me going forward for the future? And I said, but Theresa, I'm not offering you anything. This is your country decided to leave. You need to decide what you want. I'm not going to start getting involved in that kind of discussions on, you need to tell us what you want. It's not up to us to offer you something. Some in the UK criticized the EU for strategic myopia and all of this, and we can come back to that in the discussion if you like. But the point that I'm trying to make is we were on a fundamentally different paradigm in terms of how we saw the problem, the definition of the problem, and who had to solve this problem, basically. That was not a given again on the EU side. And there were, as I did quote people in the introduction, not to blame them or not to kind of say that the people were wrong, was just the expectation back then. In terms of how we then framed that, there were two fundamental issues. One was process, one was substance. The process was the sequencing. The substance is on the parameters for the future relationship. In terms of us getting Brexit done, this is Boris Johnson bulldozing through a wall to get Brexit done much later on the picture. But I stole that title as a subtitle for my book because I think in the task force we often had the feeling that we had to write quite a lot of the material that was needed to put it into the treaties to get Brexit done, basically, with a deal. So what we did first, and this was not a given again at the beginning, was to say we need to sequence these negotiations. You probably know that Article 50 is somewhat vague on the link between the withdrawal and the future. It says we need to negotiate the withdrawal, taking the future relationship into account. What that exactly meant was not clear. For the UK, it was clear. You reread Article 50 letter from May, a comprehensive agreement from the start. We're going to mix the withdrawal issues and the future relationship issues and come to a package deal. We said we need to sequence this, put the money first, and that was the crucial thing back then, not Northern Ireland. In the summer of 17, we thought the money would be a deal breaker, and the money would be the riskiest factor, so to say, to get to a no-deal situation. And we said what we have to avoid is what in academia would be called, I guess, the issue linkage between the money, the financial settlement, and the future relationship. Not just because the UK would maybe try to use the money to buy a future relationship, but also we were worried that some member states, finance ministries would be tempted towards the end of the negotiations to indeed settle on the finances and give something in return on the future relationship, which would be contradictory to the fundamental principles of our mandate on the future relationship. But there was a two-level issue in that, and maybe I'll take this opportunity to stress that I'm speaking in a personal capacity here because I'm also still an EU official. But yeah, so that sequencing was very important from that perspective. Later on, it became then citizens' right, and Northern Ireland became part of that. On the future relationship, from the very start, the first meeting that Barnier had with Prime Minister Rutte in October 16, the first Monday that he started his new job, Rutte told him basically, either it's Norway or it's free trade agreement, but whatever it is, we need very, very solid level playing field guarantees. And the Danes would say the same later, and the Belgians and the Irish and the French, of course, would say the same. There will be no trade agreement whatsoever if we don't have solid level playing field conditions. So that was from the very beginning, and you can see it in the early versions of our mandate that the level playing field comes as a precondition for any trade agreement, how minimal or maximalist it may be. The other issues, you know, the single market, the cherry picking, the integrity, the four freedoms, that's all quite known. In the literature, I read Bridget Laffan and Stefan Steller's book on Brexit, which probably you all know, where she says there is that explanation that economic interests drove this process because the single market is much more important for any member state than trade with the UK. And we use that argument a lot. Danish exports to the rest of the single market is 2/3 or 3/4 of total exports. UK is 8%, so the single market is more important. I'm somewhat looking back at that period, was struck by the fact that member states decided to set aside their economic interests, their sectorial economic interests, for the sake of a clear mandate based on principles. Obviously, for some member states, tourism and aviation was incredibly important because so many British tourists go to certain member states, like Spain, for instance, or have a second home there. For Finland, aviation was very important in terms of London, Helsinki, Japan, that kind of freedoms of aviation. For Italy, food exports was very important. For Belgium, the port of Zeebrugge is a shop for the UK. At that time, was a shop for the UK, basically. Everything, more than 50% of that port went to the UK. Obviously, the car industry or the chemical industry was very, very concerned in countries like Belgium or Germany and others. And Merkel, at some point very early in the process, told her industry, don't you put pressure on me to undermine the single market. So keep your sectorial economic interests under control for the greater benefit of the integrity of the single market. And I thought that was quite a telling episode in terms of also thinking about the causality and then more the academic side of how you explain the behavior and the position of the EU in this story. But my point is so far that, as Bridget Laffan and Stefan Telle say, right, it's about framing in the very beginning, that narrative. It's about the structures or the institutions that we set up. And I think that trumps this economic interests. But we can discuss that. And I think but that's very hard for academia, I would think, I'm not an academic, but is the political leadership, the political choices that the French president or the German chancellor took from the very beginning to say, this is what we stand for, and we're not going to deviate from this because we think this is an existential risk for the survival of the European integration process. So to speed up a bit, then we had phase one. I'm not going to talk about the chronology, just to reassure you. In phase one, we had many issues. The Court of Justice became a totemic sovereignty issue for citizens' rights, almost became a deal breaker at the very end, up until Northern Ireland took over but that was an internal UK politics, DUP, Northern Ireland politics, and UK. What I want to recall, and yeah, there are two things I want to say about phase one. The financial settlement, we got everything we had asked for, and we got everything member state had asked for. But we never expected, initially at least, that this would occur and the way in which it occurred. It's actually the first paragraph of my conclusion is we schemed all kinds of things in the very beginning in 2016, and we got more or less everything we wanted. The second paragraph is how we got there. Nobody could have known. So it's not like I'm saying, oh, we're master negotiators. The process to get there was often very random. For the Brexit bill, it was the pressure on Theresa May to move forward with Brexit. Otherwise, she would be accused domestically of betraying Brexit. And the fact that she agreed with Phil Hammond to get a transition period against David Davis and some others who were against that. And that helped to have that financial settlement fall into place, because then they stayed till the end of 2020. And we got everything we had asked for in the position paper that we published in May 27. The second thing I wanted to note, because we all look back now at that unity and said how great that was, is that we were still very worried about that unity at that particular juncture, even though phase one went reasonably well. And the most important indicator, and I have it also in the book, is that Barnier was very strict about this firewall, was often urged by member states to be stricter about this firewall between withdrawal and the future. So we didn't talk about the future up until the point we had settled the withdrawal. And then he made an exception because he was worried about foreign and security policy going forward after the withdrawal phase, that the unity would perhaps be less strong, if I put it euphemistically, on that particular aspect. And so he anticipated that by giving a speech in Berlin. It doesn't really matter anymore what and where, but he anticipated that, and again, to frame that narrative to say, I understand that the UK is a very important military security player, that some member states would think we need a more united European front on that aspect going forward. But please note, we have NATO, we have bilateral relationships between member states. And if you look at the EU, the contribution of the UK is rather minimal to EU security efforts. And so the UK is a strong military player, security player, but does not contribute it to EU efforts. But he gave that speech in November, so before we wrapped up the withdrawal agreement, basically because we were not all that confident that the unity of the 27 would hold also going forward. So I talked about the institutions and the structures. I talked about that framing. I said a few things more empirically about phase one and fears about the unity. If we then move to the future relationship discussion, if you look at what came out of the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, end of 2020, it's remarkably in line with what we discussed with member states in January, February 2018, except for a number of issues on the level playing field. I'm saying that because, again, Bridget and Stefan Telle in their book speak about the technical preparedness and the expertise as a key factor also that drove the EU's negotiation strategy and the unity of the EU, referring then to the Commission and the task force which pooled that expertise from various departments in the Commission. I'm saying that here because in that period we published around 700-800 slides on the future relationship, on all aspects of the future relationship, and discussed those with member states, because that was the period where we were moving away from the withdrawal into a discussion on the future relationship. And we can come back to that, but I think the work we did back then to create a common understanding again, based on all that with the member states was a fundamental aspect of that unity, I think. And again, we were somewhat worried going into the March 2018 European Council. It was the first time leaders would discuss the future relationship, that it would get some cracks in the unity, because these cracks started appearing at civil service level, mid-senior ambassadors, COREPER kind of things. It's only when the European leaders got together that all this was killed. So there were fears about certain countries want maybe a bit more flexible on financial services or on this and that, on aviation also was an issue back then. And the leaders killed that debate. They were not going to discuss any sectors here. We'll stick to our principles, the four freedoms, the cherry picking, the single market, and so on. And so I think that was quite an important factor there. forgot to push my slides, but this one was to illustrate the unity. This one was to illustrate what the UK did during no negotiation without notification. This is from January 2017. I can send the slides if you'd like afterwards. I have a bigger slide set as well that I can send to you. It's basically some illustrations, and this is then, of course, the thing you probably know if you worked on Brexit or studied Brexit, the staircase where we were accused by the UK of being dogmatic theologians of the EU's rule book, saying you fit in this drawer, not in that drawer, if your red lines are this or that. And some experts in the UK accused us there of that kind of strategic myopia and not wanting to create a bespoke model or a tailored model for the UK. And I'm happy to come back to all of that in discussion in terms of the substance, because I'm not going to say anything by introduction on what is in the Withdrawal Agreement or the TCA, but if you have questions or you want to go into that discussion, I'm happy to do so. There are two more things I just would like to say quickly before opening to your remarks and questions. One is on the UK. And again, the book is not about the UK, and so I hesitate a little bit, but the way the UK approached certain things has also shaped the way these negotiations panned out. And one is on Northern Ireland, where the UK repeatedly, both May and Johnson, Theresa May and Boris Johnson, have tried to use Northern Ireland to put pressure to get something for the future relationship. And this is this kind of issue linkage that I discussed earlier, which in both cases we resisted. May tried to use the Northern Ireland situation to get free movement of goods, and so to get single market participation for goods. Johnson tried to use non-compliance with Northern Ireland that he had agreed to put pressure on the EU to get rid of level playing field, in a nutshell, or to get rid of certain level playing field obligations that we were asking for. What I say in the book is that there are a couple of fallacies there in terms of how the UK approaches negotiations, and one is, for me, some kind of addiction to confrontation with the EU. And of course, you have to be tough sometimes in negotiations, and you have to oppose the other party. But if you oppose the other party on the fundamentals that it's asking, or that it's saying it stands for, in my view, it's a boomerang that you use, and it diminishes your own influence in negotiations. You gain influence in negotiations by giving something that the other party values, not by telling the other party, you're asking me for the wrong stuff, or your mandate is not correct. This is what we need to do because this is in both our interests. So by kind of attacking what the other party stands for doesn't really give you much leverage in negotiations, in my view. I think this is very clear in the level playing field context. When we started negotiating with David Frost in March 2020, he basically ripped up the political declaration that he had signed a few months earlier. So I'm no longer standing by what we had agreed there. And I want only WTO level playing field obligations, which we can discuss how that differs from state aid policy in the EU, but it fundamentally differs in terms of notification, in terms of granting aid, in terms of retaliation or remedies when illegal aid is given, basically. From the very start, I quoted Rutte earlier, people drew Barnier's attention to the red bubble there, which says we're 0 kilometers away with the Channel Tunnel, and our trade intensity is enormous. And so if the UK is going to undercut us with social, environmentally cheaper production standards or with state aids, it will be a disastrous or negative for the economy, for my manufacturing industry in particular, and also my service industry. And therefore, there was no way, as I said earlier, that we could settle a deal without level playing field obligations. My point here is more a negotiation point. Frost, by telling us, I'm not giving you anything on level playing field for 8-9 months, basically cornered the UK by not engaging with what was a fundamental requirement of member states. And what was something that they had said from the start, we will not even sign a trade agreement if there are no level playing field obligations that protect us. And for me, you undermine your influence in negotiations through those kind of confrontational tactics. The same holds true for fisheries. And again, for me, that comes then back to the unity and how to explain the unity. The way the UK approached these negotiations is certainly something that galvanized the unity at crucial moments. In September 2020, the UK then had this internal market bill, which was the violation of the Withdrawal Agreement for Northern Ireland, which certainly also fortified the unity going into the end game of those negotiations. There were some other fallacies there, but the idea that the EU would budge the last minute, which was, for me, a total misreading of the existential in-out nature of the referendum. There a lot of discourse in the UK about, in the end, you see what they did with Ireland and Denmark, they voted like this, and then they tried to change. But in the end, there's always a deal that comes out of this. Fundamentally underestimating that this referendum was different from referendums in the other countries that had rejected treaty changes. And I think that's a very important misunderstanding, certainly an important segment of the UK, to confuse the nature of the in-out referendum with other referendums that had rejected certain EU changes or adjustments to treaties. Yes.
On this slide, can I just ask, what would the size of the bubbles look like if you take percentages? Because now the area of the bubble, the UK, looks big.
Yes.
But we don't know how big it would be as a percentage of its own trade volume.
Of the UK?
Yeah. So
the vertical axis, you mean?
No. The size of the bubble. Not,
yes.
Not
yes.
where it is.
Yes.
Because on the vertical axis, you have the percentages.
Yes.
But that's of the EU.
Yes.
As a percentage of the EU.
Mm-hmm. Of goods only, which is also, it excludes services.
Well, I can't read it anyway. But the size of the bubble is not a percentage. It's the trade volume for the UK, but not as a percentage of its with the EU, but not as a percentage of its total.
No,
and it could be.
No, we wanted to express the exposure of the EU in terms of the UK, but we were legitimately criticized for what you just said. And we had no convincing technical answer to what you just said. We wanted to have a visual that says they're very close and they're a very big exporter-importer. And so that was part of what we wanted to frame as a narrative, if I put it like that. And compared to others, they're less important trade partners, the ones that are very close, or we have a border with them, Switzerland, Ukraine, or the ones that are further away. But you're absolutely right that it doesn't, your point is well taken. And some people picked us up immediately on Twitter when we came out with this. Yes.
I'm reassured.
Yes. Even though some small print that you can't use, but I'm happy you're reassured after my explanation.
Well, I'm reassured that you're
No, but it's to be fair to the slide, it still expresses what we wanted it to express, right? They're very close and they're very big as an exporter-importer, and so we have to be careful on level playing field. It's not like South Korea, where we have level playing field commitments on the car industry, for instance, and with Japan, which were quite far-reaching, and which the UK rejected with us during the negotiations. So Frost said, even when we said, okay, you're giving us less than Japan, that's just the way it was. At the same time, the UK rolled over our agreement with Japan and gave Japan better level playing field conditions than what they were offering to us in the negotiations at the same time, which we then used as an argument to say, you're not consistent here. We are a close competitor. You're having given this to Japan because you cut and paste most of the EU-Japan trade agreement into a UK-Japan trade agreement. So we managed to come to the logical inconsistencies there of the UK's position at that time. I would say that member states were willing to go for no deal if we didn't have level playing field and fisheries. And again, that's quite remarkable to think about the nature of the EU, where I started, and the EU's unity. On Ireland, Baltic countries or Cyprus or Slovenia said we stand with Ireland on level playing field Obviously, the North Atlantic, North Sea countries were much more concerned than Bulgaria or some other country. On fisheries, some landlocked countries were showing solidarity with fishery countries. So even when this no deal threat was on the table, that unity held. So that comes back to the economic interest point. Obviously, a no deal was in no one's economic interest, neither the UK, but not of any individual member states. But member states were willing to indulge in the no deal scenario for the sake of the unity of the EU. There were tiny cracks now and then, or perhaps some, but they were never such that they would actually break that unity. And I think that's also a very important point. Maybe I'll just stop here because there's a few more things I wanted to say on the difference between EU and UK politics, which is probably also something. Well, just telegraphically, perhaps, I think I don't want to engage in, I always hesitate when we have these presentations, I'm not engaging in putting down the UK as an EU negotiator. And we have to be mindful as well that for us, it was much easier, with the benefit of hindsight, perhaps, than for the UK, which was highly political. Divided Tory party, divided May government. I spoke about our building up these 700 slides, building up the unity on the future relationship in January, February 2018. In the book, I recount that in February 18, there were 5 ministers of Theresa May's government who gave speeches on the future, and they all contradicted each other. David Davis, Michael Gove, Liam Fox, Boris Johnson, and then Theresa May herself, who gave a speech. And there were incoherences between all these speeches on the nature of the trade relationship, on the security. And so it was much more difficult, of course, for the UK team to negotiate on behalf of a divided principle. Now, why that principle was divided and nobody ever tried to unite it is a question UK politics will also have to answer in a way, or people who study UK politics may want to look at that. But so it was in that sense easier for us as a EU, of course, because we had the unity and because we sustained the unity and we had the trust of the principles which were united around the core issues of our mandate. I think we also have to be mindful that we build up that trust over time, and especially what I said earlier on the financial settlement, that we delivered everything, partly because of some coincidence of external events we had not foreseen, but that certainly also sustained, built up, co-created that trust of the member states in the task force as a negotiator. And yeah, so and a final issue on the unity I would just mention again telegraphically is that and that is underestimated in my view in the literature so far, is once the unity is there, the exit cost of the unity for any member state was very high. To break that unity, once it was there, for the sake of the UK that was leaving, was incredibly high. And I recount in the book Salzburg, which is then the big diplomatic debacle for May's checkers for freedom of movement of free movement of goods plan, stay in the single market for goods, where they said, well, we'll lean on Orban, we'll lean on some other countries. And Orban didn't speak up. He didn't say anything at the Salzburg summit. And so, but why would he, is my point in the book. Why would he say something that helps the UK and that annoys France or Germany? For what would he gain as Hungarian prime minister? And so I think the exit cost of unity is something which I think should also be taken into account, as well as, and that's then again a negative factor, but that the fear of some prime ministers that by giving free movement of goods without free movement of people, they would face the same request domestically. And that some constituencies in some member state would say, but hey, wait a minute, if the UK can restrict free movement of people, but still free movement of goods stays, why can't we do that as a member? So the whole issue there about, we don't want to wake up sleeping dogs in terms of request for restrictions to free movement in my country as a member state, also played a very important role in that unity. On the no deal, that's my final point. I think we have to be mindful that this negotiation was not like any other, in the sense that the no deal was not a status quo, but a cliff edge for the UK. And we, on the Commission side, started preparing for no deal in December 17. So very early in the process, and the UK today still doesn't have a fully operational border control system in place. And that's 7 years after the referendum. And so clearly the UK was less prepared for a no deal situation than the EU. And that, I think, has also affected the power play, so the asymmetrical nature of these negotiations. Maybe I'll leave it there, Daniela. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So we can open the floor for comments and questions and have I think, quite an informal discussion about your book. We start with Calypso. Now you need to click on your microphone and then remember to switch it off.
Really, I would have been very polite and first hear your comments and everybody else's, but I have to ask a question and then leave. Unfortunately, I had a pre-arranged meeting that I can't miss. And of course, I come to this talk having had many fascinating conversations with Stefan over the years, having been very involved in these negotiations, including for 5 years leading a Brexit group in Oxford. And I'm not going to ask all of the questions I burned to ask, but partly, I guess, to me, the question to this day remains about analyzing this with more, what happens when you analyze, everything you say makes sense, right? It's hard to push back. It's great. I mean, I guess I do have a question about where, if anywhere, do you disagree with Bridget's, with the Lafan book that you spoke of? Because it's the same kind of thing. We were good. It was not so easy, but we maintained unity and Now on that very basic line, I guess, my question about explanation, and you said you didn't want to be, academic or explanatory, but you do give a lot of explanations. We created trust. We were strategically savvy. We had our task force, but we spoke with member states, etc. Everything you've said. But to me, the biggest explanatory, one big explanation is, of course, what a mess they were in the UK side. No question. I knew so many diplomats who were kicked out of the Europe, so they lost. When you wonder why they were so bad, simply the manpower. Anyone who knew something about the EU was gone within a few months, or most people. So many people in charge just didn't know the EU. That, to me, that's one explanation on the UK side. In addition to the ideology and the Tory weirdness and all the rest of it. Yes, that's there. But then there is asymmetric power. I'm an IR person, the EU was 6-7 times bigger than the UK. I mean, the leverage, bargaining leverage. So why is the we were clever explanation more important than we were more powerful? Which doesn't speak badly to the EU, but it's, And then the second question is, about the whole level playing field and all of that. Because, and of course, indeed, this graph. I mean, I've always wondered, and at the time I wondered, and I asked you and I asked others, are you really, really thinking that the UK would, are you sincerely fearing, a Singapore model? I lived 23 years in the UK. I couldn't even imagine it, knowing the political economy of the UK, labor unions. I just couldn't imagine it. Maybe I was wrong, but I just didn't think it was plausible. So that really, like, the kind of undermining level playing field in a big way on one side. On the other side of the argument is the argument that the elephant in the room and the actor you don't speak of is all of the other third countries that were watching that and are still watching the EU and do have a problem with take it or leave it standards, do have a problem with the fact that in the name of level playing field or in the name of whatever, they're not contesting health standards for a product that you sell to the EU. I mean, let's just, put that aside. But if we're talking about professional standards or even financial standards, I mean, there's a lot of argument in IPE that, there is a margin of difference that you can accept without being unfair comparative advantage. And the EU just didn't want to look at this, probably for principled reason and simplification reason. Rather than hardcore economic, they will undermine us, which I didn't believe. And I know that for me personally, I would have advocated at the time to kind of coming up with a more creative way of involving some more recognition, some more idea of compatibility, because many other, and then trust me, Stefan, I have talked with the Canadian, the Swiss, the many other third parties. And it's not as though they applaud with two hands. We're still in that world where the third countries wonder, will the EU, adapt a bit that model? Okay, that's my two questions. And then I'm going to have to run and be super rude after your answer.
Well, what if I give a very long answer? But no, I'm going to reply as a practitioner first to your question first on unity and were we so clever or symmetric. And I think part of the explanation certainly lies outside of the Commission. And so that goes beyond then what Bridget says about the framing and Stefan Telle, the technical preparedness, which is of course is part of the Commission, and the structures that we created. And I said was basically that the German Chancellor and the French President very early on took a number of key decisions, and they said we will try and stick together throughout this whole story as well. So it was a political choice. Why? Partly because they saw it as an existential threat, partly because we had all these crises before that with the near Brexit story and all those things, and the migration and all the divisions that had. And this was quite an easy case to unite, in a way. I put it a bit more cynically. And it was objectively easier for the EU than for the UK to do Brexit. I mean, it's just easier to... One of the 28 goes, okay, it's a big economy, it's a net contributor. That was our big fear in the beginning. We lose 10 billion euro. If you look back at this now, with Next Gen EU, that's all gone. But yes, that was very important. On Singapore, I personally never believe, because they don't have the fiscal capacity. And the whole issue in the UK is invest in public services rather than downgrade the social model, so to say. There's some interesting pieces that say that the UK, since Brexit, has become more European as a social model in a way. So I never thought they would have the capacity to do that. But, and again, that's the practitioner's answer. In his first tour of capitals, Rutte's, Hollande, the Taoiseach, Dublin, Sweden, Denmark, all raised it and said, this is a really serious concern. They're so close to the single market. Can the UK become an investment hub from manufacturing, serve the European market from the UK, and unfairly compete with my economy, in a nutshell? And so you can say, was it ever serious? It was certainly a serious concern from the leaders concerned of those member states. And the UK itself fueled that flame by saying, well, if you don't give us a good deal, we'll go for Singapore on Thames. So whether it was credible or not, it was there, and it was a concern. And if I come back then to the negotiations in 2020, it was clear to me as we went back and forth to the member states, to say, okay, this is what happened in the negotiations, debrief them. Member states would say, well, as long as there's nothing on level playing field, there's no point to move an inch on what we want for level playing fields. And we're heading for no deal if there's no level playing field. So yes, that was serious. Of course, then if you look back now, COVID came, the whole state aid policy. But okay, that was neither here nor there at that time. That answers part of your question. I think your other question is more like a question of frustration by third countries with the EU as a regulatory power, in a way.
It's a big discussion.
And I would say that part of that has the idea that we have that power, or that Brussels effect that people talk about, was part of why we didn't want to engage in discussions on mutual recognition of standards, which you and I discussed so often, because we didn't want to share that power, certainly not with a country that was leaving. Now, I'm not here to, I don't know about the frustration of third countries with all of that, but the EU is a big market, and yeah, that's just the way that's just the way it works, right? And that's a power argument, I guess. I would say one more thing though on the level playing field. Theresa May was fundamentally different from Johnson, because in the backstop we had with Theresa May, she said, "Oh, on state aid, we're a model member state. I'll sign up. Dynamic alignment, Court of Justice, yes, as long as the backstop applies. We'll do that. Social, environmental standards, even some minimal taxation issues." And she had no qualms politically. It's just when Johnson came, for him, level playing field became a totemic issue of the EU doesn't want a real Brexit. They want us to stay in their regulatory orbit, which then comes back to your point about the third countries. We said, no, we just want an international agreement, level playing field obligations. We don't need the Court of Justice. It's a free trade agreement. That's all fine. But for them, it was an ideological issue as well in terms of breaking free from the EU's regulatory power in a way. Has that happened so far? I'm not so convinced in the UK. No. You're welcome, Khalid.
So, question, Michael?
Great, thank you very much.
Maybe also for you to, if it works, something.
Thanks so much. It was a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it immensely.
Thank you.
And just a couple of points. I seem to recall that at the time Mr. Barnier was appointed, that the British were very annoyed by this, because I remember joking, and I'm going from my own kind of hazy memory, that saying to some friends of mine in America, like, the cheek of the EU to appoint someone who actually knew what he was doing really well, you know. So my question would be, can you say a word about the actual selection of Mr. Barnier for the post? Because I just can't quite remember. Was it sort of, was he the automatic, we've got to pick him, he's the most knowledgeable? You know, if you could say a bit about that, I'd be very interested. And then secondly, as regards Barnier, having done a very good job, he kind of didn't get a great, maybe I'm conflating different things, but he didn't get much of a thank you, say, from France. Like, he didn't do well in terms of trying to become president of France. One might have thought, you know, I've just done a fantastic job on Brexit, but then he didn't do well at all. And I'm just, you know, it could have no connection, but if you have anything to say about that, I'd be very interested.
Barnier was chosen in July, towards the end of July, after a few weeks of internal consultations. It was part of that uncertainty about who would be the lead negotiator for Brexit, the Commission or some other kind of structure. And so part of why Juncker appointed a politician, in my view, was to increase the chances of the Commission becoming the chief negotiator. Barnier had ran against Juncker for the leadership Spitzenkandidat in 2014 and got quite a significant number of votes in the EPP party congress, above 30%, I think 39, I'm not entirely sure. So he was quite a considerable competitor of Juncker for the top job at that time, and had a good standing with the European Parliament, with all groups, Greens, Social Democrats from the financial crisis time, EPP, of course, his own group, Liberals, others. And so that was also an important motivation, that the Parliament was a veto player in this. They had to consent to the Withdrawal Agreement, and so had to be kept closely on board. He only then became later the chief negotiator in December 16, when the European Council decided on that structure. It's quite an interesting conclusion in a way. It appoints the Commission as chief negotiator, and then adds a sentence that Michel Barnier is a very capable person or something. I'm just something like that, to that effect. So it was quite saying, like, it's the Commission, but it has to be Barnier, and he constructed that role. Hence, for me, that picture here as some kind of hybrid. He's in the Commission, but also kind of works for the European Council and sits in the European Council, at least for the Brexit part of the negotiations. What happened afterwards? Well, he tried to run for Les Républicains, the right-wing party, the People's Party. They're called the Republicans. And for I recall, there were 4 primary candidates who each got more or less a quarter of the votes. But he just fell short, and that's, yeah. But so he also ran against Macron in that sense. And of course, Macron got re-elected, and that's also part of where he is today then in that sense. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. My name is Patrick Wall. I'm an independent consultant, recently moved to Florence, and I'm also involved in the Institute for Global Negotiation based in Zurich. You mentioned a few times during your presentation the sort of anti-EU sentiment and the kind of Brexiteer type sentiment that arose in a number of EU countries immediately following the vote. And as far as I can tell, at least, those calls for other countries to leave the EU have dampened to almost a whimper in the years since. I'm sure that kind of public sentiment was something that you were very conscious of during the negotiations, but I'd be interested to hear any thoughts that you have on how that influenced your actual strategy, looking at how your approach to the negotiations, obviously with the UK, how to the degree to which that was influenced by what the public mood is going to be in Greece or Italy or France or wherever, looking in on those negotiations a little bit from the outside.
Certainly, I would say that fear of contagion was on the minds of some national governments and also of the Commission. But in the first place of national governments, especially those that were facing elections. At that time, Hollande was still in power and Macron was not yet credible, or he was not yet a candidate, so nobody thought Macron could become president. And so there was a bit of lack of clarity there on who would run for, but Le Pen would run, that was for sure, and was polling very high. Renzi was quite in a shaky position in Italy because he had also called for a referendum a few months after the British referendum, but on a domestic issue. But he lost it and had to go. And so I remember this Economist cover with the Tower of Pisa, and it was, of course, in the Italian colors. And
Pizza or something.
I also remember going with Barnier to Rome, and I come back to you. And people say, yeah, is Renzi going to go? And what then? Yes, he may go, but then somebody else will come and everything remains the same. That was kind of the diplomatic flavor of what we got. And then I think Gentiloni became prime minister, or someone else in between, I forgot now. Anyway, Renzi resigned. Salvini was polling high. Wilders, as I said earlier, in Sweden as well, Jimmy Åkesson, some other countries. And so certainly some prime ministers urged the EU to have a very tough approach for the fear of potential ramifications domestically. So that was certainly an issue that then, in that sense, influenced the way we had to approach these negotiations. I don't know, negotiation or notification was quite tough on the UK. A big country, G7 member, to say, okay, you give us your letter, we're not going to talk to you about anything, test balloons, whatever, before we get your letter. It was the right approach, I think, but it is quite tough to tell to a member state that they're saying, we're leaving, but we're still a member state. I'm not going to talk to you about that. And so the anti-EU sentiment seems to have, at least those parties, in my view, seem to have softened their discourse. And it's now on changing the EU from within. We need a different EU, which is what Åkesson in Sweden does, but also some others. Salvini, certainly, that's a different story, became part of Draghi government. So there's a whole domestic politics issue as well, I guess, there. But that's probably one of the, very pro-EU government, obviously. So the anti-EU sentiment has certainly been damaged by Brexit. Now, whether other factors can fuel it and bring it back, I'm not an expert on Euroscepticism, but I guess there would be.
Can go to the next.
Yes, thank you so much for coming. My name is Roman Verheyen. I'm a first-year master's student here at the School of Transnational Governance, and I just did my traineeship at the External Action Service in the Policy Planning Division.
Mhm.
So I got my first feeling for the EU institutions, which was quite great. My question is more practically, or because I was interested how reliant you were on inside informations from the UK, maybe through whistleblowers, journalists. How much information could you gather then? How much did they help you in the negotiations? And second part, how important were informal negotiations behind closed doors at dinners, coffee? I try to understand the EU better practically, you know. Tea, beer.
Your first question is interesting because it then comes back to my task in the task force, which was, at least during the withdrawal negotiation, I was the only one who went to London to talk publicly or to talk privately to people and indeed see what the mood was basically. And to get that inside information and talk to media experts, think tanks, people who are talking heads, who are influential people in the public debate. What I always found was this part of the media or the experts got it, in my view, in the way we saw Brexit and the way it panned out. This is a UK thing and the UK has to solve this. But an important part, and influential media, were very much part of that government discourse. In the end, there will be something there for us. In the end, the EU will change its position and be more accommodating, and that tailor-made or bespoke economic model we want will come true. And they also believed fundamentally in that. And so that was quite important to feed that back into the process in Brussels. I was quite shocked by, I mean, there are three types of media, I think, if I categorize it. There's the media who got it, as I say, and who then reports on it, and people went to, reporters went to companies or went to Dover or said, this is going to affect the operations here, and this is how it will work in case there's a free trade agreement, kind of putting the facts out there. There was another part of the media that didn't really care about facts and that just wanted to be part of the Westminster kind of story on Brexit, the tabloids, but also some of the broadsheets media that would applaud whenever there was a confrontational approach, and even though that politicians would then tune into that for short-term gains. What struck me always in that is that their Brussels correspondents of these papers mainly would then say, yeah, we were asked to give a quote just to give credibility to the story. And I told them the story is wrong from the Brussels perspective, but they didn't want to listen to me. The main desk in London said, this is the line we're going to take, which I thought was quite interesting to understand the media. And then there was that part in between that was genuinely convinced that the UK was more powerful in these negotiations than I was telling them, basically. But from a genuine conviction of, you know, and in the end, what I said earlier, there will be something in there for us. The EU always budges the last minute. You know, there's these long summits that don't end and so on, which for me fundamentally, and I told them that, but they didn't believe it because their cognitive frame was somewhere else. I said, you know, it's not, you can't reason like that because you, as an out means you're a third country and you lose influence. There's last minute budging for everyone to have a new budget or to have something on rule of law or whatever we need to do between members, but not with an outsider. And I think that was, so that was part of my job, was to feed that inside information from London into the process. What I also would say to that is that the member states shared information with us as Commission, which is quite unique. So David Davis came to see us. This is what he told us, this is what my minister replied. Whereas usually, of course, member states in the council work in the council, try to change the Commission's proposal on something, work against the Commission, work in support of the Commission's proposal, or somewhere in between. Here it was more like this Team Europe thing that we talk about a lot in Brussels these days. Like we're part of the same team, so let's share information. And the UK underestimated that because they were then going to these member states to say, why don't you lean on Barnier to change his position? And the member state will say, Barnier is doing what we're asking him to do. So we're part of that team. So that was also part of the inside information, is that we, member states shared a lot of information with us. The importance of informal back channel, I think not for the substance of negotiations, but more to create an atmosphere. So we try to, Barnier always tried to invite people for lunch, and the Berlaymont, there's a restaurant on the 13th floor, and so took David Davis there, and then Dominic Raab, and then Steve Barclay, and then David Frost. But in return, also, Barnier was invited to the British residence, which is in the heart of the political center of Brussels, Belgium, in that sense, so a very nice residency, obviously. And so, but that never really, I wouldn't say that that has affected the negotiations. Because on our side, we would then go back to the member states. So we had breakfast with David Frost and his team, or 2-3 people, and this is what was said. And the member states would tell us, well, if he threatens no deal on Northern Ireland, let's just wait and see what happens. If he says, David Frost, as he did in July 19, we're not going to, you drop the backstop or there's no deal. That's the binary choice the EU has. That happened over one of these informal conversations. We went back to the member states. We said, well, let's just wait and see. If that is indeed what they want, that will be their responsibility. So in that sense, it was quite a formally structured process on our side. So the scope to do informal deals was much reduced in that sense. There's an episode in the book where I speak about that, because everything that we did was known in the Council, which is unlike what's happening in other negotiations that the Commission conducts on behalf of the EU. And we also had, as part of that December 16 deal, that we were the only negotiator, someone from the Council at the negotiation table, which was in the December 16 context, part of a little bit of distrust still of, can we really trust the Commission? So there was a Council person that distrust never materialized. But I'm saying that now because it was then also very difficult to go behind that kind of structure, symbiotic structure with 27 plus the Commission, to have informal conversations over lunch or dinner. But in the book, I recount one rather absurd episode where on the political declaration, Theresa May's team came to see us and say, we would really like to talk to you about the political declaration, the future relationship. We were going into the end of the withdrawal negotiations. We need the political declaration on the future. But we don't want the Brexit secretary to know about this, which for us was a recipe for disaster. This was like the internal UK divisions displayed to us. And so that was amazing. That was absolutely amazing. And people in the UK who then found out sometimes about the mayhem, as Calypso said earlier, in the UK politics, said, oh, but Barnier must be uncorking the champagne there and celebrating because our chaos of politics here. For us, it was the opposite. We were worried. Like, this is going to the wall. This is going to go to no deal. How can we negotiate with people who can't tell each other that they're doing something with us? Where is their transparency? There's no united front there. Dominic Raab, who was Brexit secretary for four months, I think. When David Davis resigned, he took over for 4 months and then resigned because he was against the Northern Irish protocol. The backstop, as it was called, which Brexiteers saw as a trap set by us to keep them in a customs trade close relationship, where for us it was an important concession actually to Theresa May. It comes back to these 2 planets we spoke about earlier.
I could, if you don't want to,
yes,
it's
of course.
so
So just to clarify, that Raab was the person that May didn't want to tell.
May's team.
May's
I'm
team.
not sure about
Okay.
May himself.
Okay. I just had 2 other questions. One is very short. Was Dominic Cummings, did you come across him much, if at all, during the negotiations, is one. And then the other thing is, there was a really great event this morning here, launching a memorandum about Europe. And I just wonder, you probably didn't have a chance to, you might have been just traveling to have watched it, but it's evident that a lot of very senior European figures are worried about, that the challenges that the EU needs to face are very considerable, and there's quite an appetite to change things. So given, and I know, the lecture today is exactly what you have talked really brilliantly about, but if you had any views on, that Brexit was a job very well done by the EU, but do you have any views? I say it could be totally unfair since if you didn't see the event, but how do you feel now? Does the way the EU handled Brexit so well, that surely presumably helps in terms of moving on to deal with the new challenges? Because I think I'm right in saying like Brexit wasn't mentioned today because it's been dealt with, but I'm being very incoherent. But do you have any views on the challenges for Europe going forward, having put Brexit behind it, so to speak?
Sorry, your first question again.
Yes. Did you, because
Yes.
he's such a bogeyman, did he get a chance himself to be involved on the British side?
Not in negotiating with us. I guess in Downing Street, he must have played an important role. He steered some quite aggressive communication campaign against Barnier, notably here when we published that. They tweeted from number 10 to say, well, Michel Barnier, what happened here? And they tagged him at that. We always said we could get a free trade agreement, and now it's a free trade agreement with strings attached, level playing field. You never told us that. So it was quite, even though level playing field was from the very start a core request on our side. So he, from reconstructing a bit, was also quite a how to put this, get Brexit done. He's a mastermind of campaigns, right? 3 words: take back control. Who said, well, let's not bother about Northern Ireland, as I say in the book. Let's not listen to the civil service in the UK administration that says Northern Ireland is a problem. Let's just ignore all of that. So in that sense, he was not a very constructive factor, I think, within the Downing Street team to get to a fruitful outcome with us. He, and I speak quite a lot about Cummings in 2 chapters in the Irish part of the book. There's 4 chapters on Ireland, where he says basically, we were ready to walk away without a deal. We would have put pressure on the EU and they would have budged, if not for the Westminster Parliament adopting this act, which excluded us from leaving without a deal, what was called the Benn Act, which is Hilary Benn is a Labour politician who managed to push through an act to say, either we extend membership or we have a deal to leave, but the no deal, the Parliament says that this is not something that can happen. And then Johnson prorogued Parliament, and it was a whole... and many in the UK, including Cummings and one of the other advisors, say, but if that hadn't happened, that Benn Act, we would have made the EU budge. And I say in the book, it's a total misreading of the EU's position. So the Benn Act was neither here nor there for us. It's not like we sat there analyzing, okay, the Benn Act excludes no deal, the UK is weaker. We were just on the mindset of, okay, Johnson wants a different protocol with Northern Ireland. Well, let's do that and let's find a way through. On your second question, it brings me back to what I said about some academics in the beginning of my talk. I said, oh, but looking the EU without the UK, the EU needs the UK for effective leadership. I think if you look back now at the last 7 years, I don't think that has proven to be true. We always said we would be weaker without the UK, and I guess, yeah, we're weaker economically. We lost an important economy. That's all very regretful. But in terms of the EU as such, creating new instruments like Next Generation EU and borrowing, or using the peace facility to fund military equipment for Ukraine, I'm not sure if that would have happened with the UK. It's difficult to say. Ivan Rogers, who was the last permanent representative of the UK to the EU, at least, well, the second last, he resigned, so basically said at some point we would never have approved Next Gen EU, the borrowing. Then probably the EU would have found the solution outside of the treaty, but it would have been much more complicated and convoluted. And I now in my function today, of course, I represent the Commission, but when I speak about Brexit, I say, well, for me, is a broader point here about this kind of geopolitical awakening of the EU, of course, forced by pandemic and Ukraine, but the way the EU defended its interests in the UK Brexit story, for me, has contributed to thinking, okay, we are in favor of a rules-based order in single market, or we are in favor of a global multilateral rules-based order on trade and open trade. But if the others don't play ball, then we can't be naive and keep defending those rules if they don't work in our interest. And so we have to stand up for our own interest a lot more than we would in the past, and defend our interest in terms of economic interest. And I think that's part of perhaps a new era in EU integration history, that kind of more geopolitical defense of what we stand for. And Trump and Brexit are certainly contributing factors to that, I think. Let's not forget that Trump came to power a few months after the referendum. We haven't mentioned that, but that was also a very important factor in how the EU approached this. Yeah.
I have a methodological question, but not in the usual sense. But I was wondering, you as an author, having been an important part in these negotiations, how you write a book like that, because you give an account, and you said at the beginning you don't pretend drawing big theoretical conclusions and the frameworks and all that, and I think it's part of the strength also of this kind of books, is to give an account of what has happened. But still, you were on one side, and to give an account of a negotiation, in a way, you would need to be on both sides. Or then you give an account from how it was perceived, how the other side is perceived on your side. But it's still a bit, I think, for an author, an issue that I'm sure you came across. And what did you do? Did you conduct interviews, for example, in the UK? Did you say, okay, actually, I would need to know this, and I don't. Who could I ask on the UK side? Not during the negotiation, but while writing the book. And I would imagine that this is a methodological problem, then to give an entire and encompassing account of. And the same, for example, an indicator of that would be certain reactions that you got in the UK. If you got a reaction of the sort, no, it wasn't like that at all. And he couldn't know because he was sitting on the other side.
Yes.
And my second question is very simply, very quickly, any regrets? Do you have any regret? Is there anything that you think during the negotiation, your side, could have done differently?
Thank you. That's great questions to wrap this up. I think that on the book, and I spoke to the EI alumni in Brussels a few weeks ago, and there was a historian, of course, who then said, but there's no sources. And
But you are the source.
How can you say you have to trust me for it? This is my story. And I tried in the beginning to go more into the UK. And also I tried to do it non-chronologically in the beginning. So the first version. And I had to go back, first of all, to more chronologically. It's not fully chronologically, as in part on Ireland, which then from the beginning to the end. So part 3 goes back to the very beginning. Part 1 and 2 is more chronological. Then I showed it to a British academic, and he said, but why do you talk about the UK? I mean, your strength is the EU. And you're not someone who is credible to talk about causality in the UK. So then I said, yeah, that's absolutely correct. And then I used the UK as a bit of a backdrop to how we as EU negotiated. So it is the story from the EU's perspective, and I say that in the very beginning. And the only critique that I've seen so far that says there's things missing is David Frost. So that's another practitioner. He did a review for the House of Commons magazine, where he said the phone call between Merkel and Johnson at the height of a crisis on the Northern Irish Protocol, where Cummings sat in as well, is wrongly depicted. I don't think that's correct, but okay, and one or two things are missing that are fundamental. Okay, that's another story about Cummings, because then he briefed the press on that phone call to the extent that he said that also Germany may leave the EU at some point, which was not very well received in Berlin. So that's, yeah, and so it's a contribution from our side, from the EU side. I think it's important that we talk about Brexit from non-British sources as well, because obviously it has been an all-consuming story in the UK. And
maybe
yes.
just on this point, maybe the book then will be treated as a source. More
well, it's like again, Bridget Laffen, but she came to interview me. I was a source, and other academics come to see me, and then I'm a source. So in that sense, I was saying in the beginning, this could be a source for academic research as well. But I think it hasn't been attacked for having things fundamentally wrong. And I used, and that's then comes back to your inside information, my notes of going to London. And quite remarkably, journalists these days share a lot of information. Maybe that's an impact of social media, but top journalists from different organizations, oh yeah, this minister told me off the record this, that off the record. That's anonymous usually. Okay. So I took notes of that, and that helped as well. On the regrets, it's on the negotiations, you mean, right? On regrets in terms of negotiating.
yeah, maybe
things.
concessions that maybe we should have done, or
The biggest regret Juncker had was that he stayed out of the campaign, as Cameron asked him to do. I personally think it wouldn't have made a difference, but that's a very personal point. Most people in the Commission in Brussels, oh, if only we could have gotten involved in the campaign, we would have given facts and stuff. I'm not sure if facts mattered all that much in the campaign, but Juncker regretted not getting involved. During the negotiations, some people ask me about Ireland, but I'm not sure how we could have done it differently. I mean, we kind of knew when Johnson signed the Northern Irish Protocol that the idea was to change it later in the negotiations on the future. Well, what do you do as a negotiator? You have the government in front of you and you need to sign. People told us with May, don't you see that she's never going to have a majority for what she's trying to do? So, but then what do you do as Commission? Theresa May is Prime Minister, and she says, this is what I want, and I'm going to push it through Parliament. And she didn't manage to. And so you could say ex post, that's a source of regret, but at the time, I don't see what we could have done differently. And Theresa May, and I think she may not be totally wrong, there's just a podcast, The Rest is Politics, and there is a leading with Theresa May. If you're interested in Brexit, there's a second episode where she blames the Speaker of the House for not putting the motion that she wanted there. My impression was always that Theresa May's deal, the people on Theresa May's team said, we will exclude the no deal option. The second referendum option, sorry. So we will kill that. And then those people, MPs who want to overturn Brexit will have to realign and will rally to a softer Brexit. That never happened. It's a source of regret, I guess, from May's team. And you could also question, where would we be today in terms of, there would be a much closer relationship today. But that didn't happen.
okay. I need to run, but so let me close officially the session, thanking you again for really a very, very interesting book presentation, and everyone for participating. Apologizing because I have to run to the next meeting, and not having been a very good host, I hope we have the pleasure of having you at the UI again soon. But please feel free to go ahead and maybe even go for coffee and continuing formally this conversation.